The poker chips clattered against the wooden table as Cowboy Tom Ashford threw down his final bet. Across from him sat Garrison Blackthorne, the wealthiest rancher in 3 counties, his cold gray eyes studying the cards in his weathered hands. The saloon had fallen silent except for the tick of the grandfather clock and the nervous breathing of onlookers who'd gathered around their high-stakes game. "I'll see your 500 head of cattle," Blackthorne drawled, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd never lost anything that mattered to him. "And I'll raise you something far more valuable." Tom's sun-weathered face remained impassive, though his blue eyes flickered with curiosity. He'd been playing cards since he could barely see over a table, and something in Blackthorne's tone set his teeth on edge. "My daughter, Isabella," Blackthorne continued, ignoring the sharp intake of breath from the crowd. "She's worth more than all your cattle combined. 19 years old, educated back east, and as beautiful as a summer sunrise over the canyon. Winner takes her hand in marriage." The words hit Tom like a physical blow. He'd seen Isabella Blackthorne exactly once, 3 months ago when she'd returned from her finishing school in Boston. She'd been standing on her father's porch in a blue dress that matched the Wyoming sky, her dark hair catching the afternoon light, and Tom had nearly forgotten how to breathe. But gambling with a woman's life? That crossed every line he'd drawn for himself. "You can't bet your own daughter like she's livestock," Tom said, his voice tight with controlled anger. Blackthorne's laugh was harsh as winter wind. "I can and I will. The girl's been nothing but trouble since she came back, filling her head with nonsense about women's rights and refusing every suitor I've chosen. At least this way, she'll marry a man with backbone enough to win her." Tom's fists clenched on the table. The smart thing would be to fold, walk away, and pretend this conversation never happened. But the image of Isabella's face haunted him, not just her beauty, but the fire in her green eyes when she'd argued with the preacher about women's suffrage last Sunday. She deserved better than being treated like a prize in her father's twisted game. "What happens if I win and refuse the marriage?" Tom asked. "Then you get nothing," Blackthorne replied. "The bet stands as is, marriage or nothing." Tom looked at his cards again, a full house, aces over queens, the best hand he'd held all night. But this wasn't about winning anymore. It was about saving Isabella from being bartered away like property, even if it meant sacrificing everything he'd worked for. The saloon door burst open, and Isabella herself stormed in, her dark hair wild and her green eyes blazing with fury. She'd clearly overheard enough to understand what was happening. "Father, you cannot be serious," she declared, her voice carrying the refined accent of her Eastern education mixed with the steel of the frontier. "I am not chattel to be wagered." Every man in the saloon stared, shocked by her boldness. Ladies simply didn't enter such establishments, let alone challenge their fathers publicly. "Get back to the house, Isabella," Blackthorne commanded, his face flushing red. "This doesn't concern you. This concerns me more than anyone." She shot back, "And I'll be damned if I let you decide my fate over a card game." Tom made his decision in that moment, watching this fierce woman fight for her own freedom. He'd win this hand, marry her if she'd have him, and spend his life proving he was nothing like her father. Tom's eyes never left Isabella's face as he slowly placed his cards on the table. "Call," he said simply, his voice steady despite the thundering of his heart. Isabella stepped closer to the table, her chin raised defiantly. "I want to see this hand played out," she announced. "Since my future hangs in the balance, I believe I have the right." Blackthorne's jaw tightened. "Isabella, return home immediately." "No." The single word rang through the saloon with surprising power. "I'm old enough to marry, according to you, which means I'm old enough to witness my own fate being decided." Tom found himself admiring her courage even more. She stood there in her simple green dress, facing down a room full of rough men and her own intimidating father, refusing to be dismissed like a child. "Fine," Blackthorn snarled. "But when this cowboy loses everything, don't come crying to me." He laid down his cards with a triumphant smirk. Straight flush, 8 high. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. It was a strong hand, the kind that won most games. Tom felt Isabella's eyes on him as he reached for his cards. "Full house," Tom said quietly, spreading his cards across the table. "Aces over queens." The silence stretched for heartbeats before erupting into chaos. Men shouted and whistled, money changed hands on side bets, and Blackthorn's face turned purple with rage. "Impossible!" Blackthorn roared, lunging forward to examine the cards. "You cheated." Tom stood slowly, his 6-foot frame towering over the table. "Careful with accusations you can't prove, Blackthorn. These men all watched me play fair and square." "He's right," called out Jeremiah Kane, the town's most respected merchant. "I watched every card dealt. It was an honest game." Blackthorn's hand moved toward his gun, but Tom was faster, his own weapon halfway out of its holster before the older man froze. The message was clear. Any violence would end badly for Blackthorn. Isabella stepped between them, her hands pressed against Tom's chest. The touch sent electricity through him, and he found himself looking down into eyes that held no fear, only fierce determination. "Enough," she said firmly. The bet was made, and Mr. Ashford won fairly. She turned to face her father. "But I have conditions." "You have no right to conditions," Blackthorn spat. "I have every right," Isabella replied. "The law may say you can arrange my marriage, but it also says the bride must consent at the altar. Refuse my terms, and I'll stand mute before the preacher." Tom watched this remarkable woman negotiate her own fate and felt something shift inside his chest. He'd won her hand, but she was claiming her own power in the situation. What terms? Tom asked, genuinely curious. Isabella turned back to him, studying his face carefully. "First, we have a proper courtship, 1 month. If at the end of that time I find you unsuitable, you'll release me from this arrangement." "And if I find you unsuitable?" Tom asked, though he already knew that was impossible. A smile ghosted across her lips. "Then you're welcome to walk away from a woman who speaks her mind, reads books, and has no intention of being a silent, obedient wife. Second," she continued, "I keep my horse, my books, and my right to express my opinions." "Done," Tom said. Immediately, Blackthorn started to protest, but Isabella cut him off. "Third, we marry in the church with proper witnesses, not in some rushed ceremony. I may have been wagered like property, but I won't be wed like a shameful secret." Tom nodded. "Anything else?" Isabella stepped closer, her voice dropping so only he could hear. "I want to know why you made this bet. Was it greed, pride, or something else?" Tom looked into her green eyes and decided on honesty. "I saw you standing up to Preacher Morrison about women's suffrage, and I knew you deserved better than being bartered away. Even if I'd lost everything, stopping this bet would have been worth it." Something flickered in her expression, surprise, perhaps even a hint of approval. "1 month, Mr. Ashford," she said aloud. "Let's see what kind of man won me in a card game." 3 days after the poker game that changed everything, Tom stood outside the Blackthorn ranch house, his hat in his hands and a bouquet of wildflowers he'd picked at dawn. His palms were sweating despite the cool morning air, and he felt more nervous than he had facing down armed cattle rustlers. Isabella opened the door before he could knock, as if she'd been watching from the window. She wore a simple brown riding dress, and her dark hair was braided practically down her back. Without the formal gowns he'd seen her in before, she looked younger, more approachable, though no less beautiful. "Mr. Ashford," she said formally. "Right on time." "These are for you." Tom offered the flowers awkwardly. "I know they're not fancy like what you're probably used to, but they're perfect," Isabella interrupted, accepting them with what seemed like genuine pleasure. "Store-bought flowers die quickly, but these smell like freedom and open sky." Tom felt some of his tension ease. "I thought maybe we could ride out to Miller's Creek today. Talk some, get to know each other properly." Isabella's eyes brightened. "I'd like that. But I should warn you, I ride astride, not side saddle. Another of my many scandalous habits." "Good," Tom replied. "A woman should ride however makes her feel secure in the saddle." They walked to the stable together, and Tom watched as Isabella saddled her own horse, a spirited chestnut mare named Tempest. Her movements were confident and practiced, nothing like the helpless ornamental women he'd known in town. "You really?" "No horses," he observed. "Father may have sent me east for finishing school, but I grew up on this ranch," Isabella replied, checking her cinch with practiced ease. "I can rope a calf, brand a steer, and shoot a rattlesnake at 20 paces. The ladies in Boston were horrified by my stories." Tom found himself grinning. "I bet they were." They rode out across the rolling grassland in comfortable silence at first, the morning sun warm on their faces and the endless sky stretching above them. Tom kept stealing glances at Isabella, noting how naturally she sat her horse, how her eyes constantly scanned the horizon like a true child of the frontier. "Tell me about yourself, Mr. Ashford," Isabella said as they paused to water their horses at Miller's Creek. "I know you have a small ranch north of town, but little else." Tom leaned against a cottonwood tree, considering his words carefully. "Not much to tell. Lost my parents to fever when I was 16, been working cattle ever since. Built my place. Up from nothing, 500 acres now, with a decent herd." "That's impressive for a man your age," Isabella said. "But that's what you do, not who you are." The question caught him off guard. Most people never look deeper than his work and his reputation with a gun. "Who am I?" he mused. "I suppose I'm a man who believes in keeping his word, treating people fairly and protecting those who can't protect themselves. Is that why you really made that bet with my father?" Isabella asked, sitting on a fallen log and studying him with those penetrating green eyes. "To protect me?" Tom felt heat rise in his cheeks. "Partly, but I'd be lying if I said I wasn't hoping to get to know you better. I've been thinking about you since the day you came back from Boston." "What exactly were you thinking?" Isabella's tone was carefully neutral, but Tom caught a hint of curiosity beneath it. "I was thinking," Tom said slowly, "that you were the most alive person I'd ever seen. The way you stood up to Preacher Morrison, the way you laugh when you think no one's watching, the way you look at the world like you want to grab it with both hands and reshape it." Isabella was quiet for a long moment. "In Boston, they tried to teach me to be a proper lady. Small steps, quiet voice, no opinions on important matters. But I couldn't make myself fit into that mold. I felt like I was suffocating. And now? Now I'm engaged to a man I barely know because my father gambled me away like a poker chip," Isabella said with bitter honesty. "But at least you're asking what I think instead of telling me what to think." Tom moved closer, careful not to crowd her. "Isabella, I want you to know that bet may have brought us together, but what happens between us is up to you and me. Not your father, not society, not anyone else." For the first time since he'd known her, Isabella looked uncertain. "I don't know how to do this, Tom. Courtship, romance, it's all new territory for me." "It's new for me too," Tom admitted. "But maybe we can figure it out together." Isabella looked up at him, and Tom saw something shift in her expression. "I'd like that," she said softly. "I'd like that very much." 2 weeks into their courtship, Isabella surprised Tom by appearing at his ranch unannounced, riding her mare hard and looking troubled. Tom dropped the fence post he'd been setting and hurried over as she dismounted. "Isabella, what's wrong?" "My father," she said, breathing hard from the ride. "He's been meeting with Cornelius Vance, that railroad man from back east. They're planning something, and I think it involves you." Tom helped her down from Tempest, his hands lingering on her waist longer than strictly necessary. Over the past 2 weeks, their formal courtship had evolved into something deeper. He found himself looking forward to her visits, to their long conversations about everything from books to cattle ranching, to her dreams of seeing women get the vote. "Come inside," Tom said. "Tell me everything." His cabin was simple but clean one. Room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen area, and a bed in the corner. Isabella had been here before, and Tom noticed how she moved around the space comfortably now, like she belonged there. "I overheard them talking in Father's study," Isabella said, accepting the cup of coffee Tom offered. "Vance wants our land. For his railroad, all of it. He's been buying up properties along his planned route, but Father's been refusing to sell." "So what's changed?" Isabella's green eyes darkened with worry. "Vance knows about our engagement. He suggested that if something were to happen to you, an accident, maybe trouble with rustlers, Father would be free to marry me off to someone more amenable to business arrangements." Tom set down his coffee cup carefully, his jaw tightening. "Did your father agree to this?" "He didn't say no," Isabella replied quietly. "Tom, I think they mean to kill you." The words hung heavy in the air between them. Tom had faced death before. It came with the territory of frontier life, but knowing Isabella would be affected by his fate made the threat feel different, more urgent. "Why are you telling me this?" Tom asked. "You could have let them handle their business, maybe even found a way out of our engagement." Isabella stood and moved to the window, looking out at the land Tom had worked so hard to build up. "Because I don't want a way out anymore," she said softly. "These past 2 weeks, getting to know you, Tom, you're nothing like what I expected." "What did you expect?" She turned back to face him, and Tom saw vulnerability in her eyes that she'd never shown before. "I expected another man like my father, someone who would see me as property to be managed. But you ask my opinions, you listen when I talk, you treat me like I have a mind worth respecting." Tom crossed the room to stand beside her at the window. "That's because you do have a mind worth respecting. Isabella, you're the strongest, smartest, most incredible woman I've ever known. I'm falling in love with you," she whispered, the words coming out like a confession. "I didn't expect it, didn't want it at first, but I can't deny it anymore." Tom turned to face her fully, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. "I've been in love with you since our first ride to Miller's Creek. Maybe even since that first day I saw you arguing with the preacher." "Then we have to fight for this," Isabella said, leaning into his touch. "For us, we will," Tom promised. "But first, I need to know, are you sure about this?" "About me? Because once we stand against your father and Vance, there's no going back." Isabella's answer came not in words but in action. She rose on her toes and kissed him, her lips soft but determined against his. Tom gathered her closer, marveling at how perfectly she fit in his arms. When they broke apart, Isabella's eyes were bright with unshed tears and fierce determination. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life, Tom Ashford. You won my father's bet, but you've won my heart by choice." "Then we'll face whatever comes together," Tom said, sealing the promise with another kiss. Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, but neither of them noticed. They had found something worth fighting for, and that made them more dangerous to their enemies than Vance and Blackthorn could possibly imagine. That evening, as Tom walked Isabella partway home, she stopped suddenly and grabbed his arm. "Tom?" There's something else. Father's planning to move up the wedding. What do you mean? He wants us married this Sunday. He claims it's because he's eager to see me settled, but I think he wants you legally bound to me before Vance makes his move. A widowed daughter is more valuable than a spinster in his mind. Tom considered this. New information. Then we'll be married Sunday, but on our terms. And Isabella? Yes? After Sunday, you'll be Isabella Ashford. Whatever happens, they can't use you as a pawn anymore. Isabella smiled, and in that smile, Tom saw his future beautiful, challenging, and worth every risk they were about to take. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright, but Tom felt a storm brewing in his gut as he stood at the altar of the small wooden church. The building was packed with townspeople, all curious to witness the unusual wedding between the cowboy, who'd won his bride in a poker game, and the headstrong daughter of the wealthiest rancher in the territory. Isabella walked down the aisle. On her father's arm, resplendent in her mother's wedding dress, ivory silk with delicate lace that had been carefully preserved for this day. But Tom's eyes were drawn to her face, to the determination in her green eyes and the slight tremor in her hands that only he could see. She was nervous but resolute, ready to face their uncertain future together. Preacher Morrison opened his worn Bible and began the familiar ceremony, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed church. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of Isabella Blackthorne and Thomas Ashford in holy matrimony. Double Coutsum barely heard the words. He was too focused on Isabella's face, on the way the morning light streaming through. The stained glass windows caught the gold highlights in her dark hair. When it came time for vows, she spoke clearly and firmly, her voice never wavering. I, Isabella, take you, Thomas, to be my lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, till death do us part. Tom's voice was equally steady as he spoke his vows, meaning every word. I, Thomas, take you, Isabella, to be my lawfully wedded wife, to love and to cherish, to honor and protect, as long as we both shall live. As Preacher Morrison pronounced them husband and wife, Tom leaned down to kiss his bride, and Isabella whispered against his lips, Whatever happens next, remember that I chose this. I chose you. The words sent a chill down Tom's spine, but before he could ask what she meant, the church doors burst open. Cornelius Vance strode in with 6 armed men, their guns drawn and ready. The congregation gasped and shrank back in their pews. Sorry to interrupt the festivities, Vance called out, his Eastern accent sharp and cold. But I have business with the groom. Tom instinctively stepped in front of Isabella, his hand moving to his gun, but Vance's men already had their weapons trained on him. Easy, cowboy. No need for anyone to get hurt, yet. Garrison Blackthorne stepped forward from the front pew, his face a mask of false regret. Thomas, I'm afraid there's been a development. Mr. Vance here has evidence that you've been rustling cattle from various ranches in the area. That's a lie, Tom said flatly, his blue eyes never leaving Vance's face. Is it? Vance pulled a folded paper from his coat. I have sworn statements from 3 witnesses who saw you with stolen cattle. The penalty for rustling, as I'm sure you know, is hanging. Isabella gasped behind him, and Tom felt her hand grip his arm. The setup was obvious, but in a territory where law enforcement was scarce and justice often came at the end of a rope, false witnesses could be as deadly as real ones. However, Vance continued smoothly, I'm a reasonable man. Sign over your land to me, and these charges can disappear. And if I refuse? Vance's smile was cold as winter. Then you'll hang, and your lovely new wife will be a widow before the ink's dry on your marriage certificate. Of course, being a generous man, I'd be happy to comfort the grieving widow. Perhaps even marry her myself, consolidate our business interests. The rage that surged through Tom was white-hot, but he forced himself to remain calm. Isabella's life hung in the balance along with his own. "You have 1 minute to decide," Vance announced. Pulling out a pocket watch. Isabella suddenly stepped out from behind Tom, her chin raised defiantly. "Mr. Vance, I'm afraid you've made a tactical error." "Have I, my dear?" "Yes," Isabella said, her voice carrying across the silent church. "You see, you're not the only one who can gather evidence and witnesses." She reached into her reticule and pulled out a thick envelope. "Inside here are sworn statements from railroad workers detailing how you've been threatening and intimidating ranchers all along your planned route. There's also documentation of the bribes you've paid to various officials, including the territorial governor's office." Vance's face went pale. "Where did you get that?" "I may have been educated in Boston, but I learned to think like a rancher right here in Wyoming," Isabella replied coolly. "When I suspected you were targeting my husband, I hired a private investigator. Amazing what people will say when they think they're talking to a harmless society woman." Tom stared at his wife in amazement. While he'd been worried about protecting her, she'd been building a case to protect them both. "Furthermore," Isabella continued, "I've already sent copies of all this evidence to the Territorial Marshal in Cheyenne and the Railroad Commission in Denver. If anything happens to my husband, they'll know exactly who to blame." Vance's hand moved toward his gun, but Tom was faster. In one smooth motion, he drew and fired, the bullet shattering Vance's weapon and sending it flying from his hand. "The railroad man cried out, clutching his stung fingers. "I think," Tom said quietly, "it's time for you and your men to leave. All of you." The church erupted in cheers and applause as Vance and his hired guns retreated. Garrison Blackthorne started to follow them, but Isabella's voice stopped him cold. "Father," he turned, his face a mixture of shame and defiance. "Stay away from us," Isabella said simply. "You chose money over your daughter's happiness. Live with that choice." As the dust settled and the congregation slowly filed out, Tom turned to his remarkable wife. "How long have you been planning this?" Isabella smiled, the first genuine, joyful smile he'd seen from her all day. "Since the night I warned you about their plot. I told you I was falling in love with you, Tom. I wasn't about to let anyone take you away from me without a fight." Tom pulled her into his arms, not caring who might still be watching. "Mrs. Ashford, you are absolutely incredible." "I certainly hope so, Mr. Ashford," she replied, her green eyes sparkling. "You're going to be stuck with me for a very long time." 6 months after their dramatic wedding, Tom and Isabella had settled into a rhythm of married life that surprised them both with its contentment. The small ranch house that had once seemed perfectly adequate for a bachelor now bustled with Isabella's presence books stacked on every available surface, her easel set up by the window where the light was best, and the constant sound of her humming as she went about her day. Tom returned from checking the cattle to find Isabella in their newly expanded garden, her sleeves rolled up and dirt smudged across her cheek as she transplanted seedlings. She'd insisted on growing their own vegetables, claiming that store-bought produce lacked character. Watching her work, Tom marveled again at how she'd adapted to ranch life without losing any of her Eastern refinement or strong-willed nature. "How are the tomatoes coming along?" he asked, dismounting from his horse and walking over to where she knelt among the plants. "Beautifully," Isabella replied, sitting back on her heels to wipe her forehead with the back of her hand. "I think we'll have enough to can for the winter, with plenty left over to trade in town." Tom helped her to her feet, noting how the sun had brought out golden highlights in her dark hair and given her skin a healthy glow. Marriage and ranch life agreed with her in ways he'd never expected. "Speaking of town," Isabella said, brushing dirt from her hands, "I had an interesting conversation with Martha Kane at the general store yesterday." "Oh?" Tom began unsaddling his horse, but he was listening intently. Isabella's conversations in town often yielded important information about their neighbors and the territory's political climate. She mentioned that Cornelius Vance has been quietly selling off his railroad interests and moving back east. Apparently, my evidence packet caused quite a stir in Denver. Tom grinned. Good riddance. What about your father? Isabella's expression grew more serious. He's been trying to find buyers for portions of the ranch. Financial troubles, according to Martha. It seems his association with Vance damaged his reputation with other potential business partners. Are you sorry? Tom asked gently. He knew that despite everything, Garrison Blackthorne was still her father. Isabella considered the question carefully. I'm sorry he made the choices he did. I'm sorry our relationship had to end the way it did. But I'm not sorry we stood up to him, Tom. Some principles are worth the cost. That evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Isabella brought up a topic they'd been dancing around for weeks. Tom, I've been thinking about the future, about what we want to build here. What kind of future? Tom asked, though he suspected he knew where this conversation was heading. I'd like to have children someday, Isabella said quietly, but I want them to grow up in a world that's better than the one we inherited. I want our daughters to have choices, our sons to respect women as equals. Tom reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers. That sounds like a fine goal to me. What did you have in mind? Isabella's eyes lit up with excitement. I want to start a school, Tom. Not just for children, but for adults too. Women who want to learn to read, men who need to understand the changing laws, children who deserve better than the handful of books in the church basement. A school, Tom mused. That would be a big undertaking. I know. It would mean using some of our savings, maybe taking on debt. And we'd need to build a proper schoolhouse, find books, convince parents to send their children ... Isabella's voice trailed off. You think it's impractical. I think, Tom said slowly, that it's the kind of ambitious, impossible, absolutely necessary idea that makes me fall in love with you all over again. Isabella's face broke into a radiant smile. Really? You'd support this? Isabella, you could tell me you wanted to build a railroad to the moon, and I'd start looking for investors, Tom replied. But a school? That's not just a dream. It's exactly what this territory needs. They spent the rest of the evening planning, Isabella's excitement infectious as she outlined her vision. She wanted to teach not just reading and arithmetic, but also practical skills like bookkeeping for the women and basic law for everyone. She talked about bringing in guest speakers from Cheyenne and Denver, maybe even from back east, to expose their neighbors to new ideas and perspectives. There's one more thing, Isabella said as they prepared for bed. I wrote to some of my friends from Boston. 3 of them are interested in coming west to help with the school. They're all educated. Women looking for purpose and adventure. Tom paused in the act of hanging up his gun belt. 3 more women like you descending on our quiet little territory? The men won't know what hit them. Isabella laughed, the sound warm and rich in the lamplight. Is that a problem? Not for me, Tom assured her, pulling her into his arms. Though, I suspect life's about to get a lot more interesting around here. Good, Isabella said, rising on her toes to kiss him. Interesting is exactly what I was hoping for. As they settled into bed together, Tom reflected on how much his life had changed since that fateful poker game. He'd won Isabella's hand in a bet, but she'd won his heart through choice, determination, and the kind of love that made a man want to be better than he'd ever imagined possible. Outside their window, the Wyoming wind whispered through the grass, carrying the promise of all the tomorrows they would build together. 5 years had transformed the small, Settlement of Cedar Falls into a thriving community, largely due to the influence of the Ashford School for Progressive Learning. Tom stood in the doorway of the newly constructed brick schoolhouse, watching his wife conduct a reading lesson for a mixed group of adults and children. Isabella's voice carried clearly across the room as she helped Mrs. Patterson sound out words from a primer while simultaneously keeping an eye on young Billy. Morrison's arithmetic problems, the three friends Isabella had summoned from Boston, had indeed arrived, and their impact on the territory had been profound. Cordelia Brightwater had established the first lending library within 200 miles. Penelope Fairchild had started a women's suffrage organization that was gaining members across the territory, and Vivian Sterling had opened a medical clinic, becoming the first female doctor in the region despite considerable initial resistance. "Papa, Papa?" The excited voice of 4-year-old Margaret Ashford broke through Tom's reverie. His daughter came running across the schoolyard, her dark hair bouncing in pigtails and her green eyes so like her mother's, sparkling with excitement. Behind her toddled 2-year-old Samuel, his chubby legs working hard to keep up with his sister. "Mama said I can help with the new students tomorrow," Margaret announced proudly. "I'm going to show them where to put their coats and how to hold their pencils properly." Tom scooped both children into his arms, marveling at how full his life had become. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. Mama will be lucky to have such a good helper." Through the schoolhouse window, he could see Isabella watching them, her face soft with contentment. At 24, she was more beautiful than ever, her confidence and purpose having given her a glow that no amount of Boston finishing school could have provided. She'd found her calling in education, and the community had embraced her vision wholeheartedly. The sound of approaching hooves made Tom look up to see a familiar figure riding toward the school. Garrison Blackthorne sat straight in his saddle, despite his 60-odd years, but there was something different about him, humility that hadn't been there before. Tom set his children down and walked over to meet his father-in-law. Their relationship had been strained at best over the years, with Blackthorne making only tentative attempts to reconcile with Isabella after his disastrous association with Vance had nearly cost Tom his life. "Blackthorne." Tom nodded politely. "Tom," the older man replied, his voice hoarse. "Is Isabella available? I have something important to discuss with both of you." Tom studied Blackthorne's face, noting the way his hands trembled slightly as he dismounted. "She's finishing up the afternoon session. You're welcome to wait." They stood in awkward silence until Isabella emerged from the schoolhouse, her students filing out behind her with cheerful goodbyes. She stopped short when she saw her father, her expression guarded but not hostile. "Father," she said simply, "what brings you here?" Blackthorne removed his hat, turning it nervously in his hands. "I have news. The railroad finally bought my remaining land. I'm leaving for California next week." Isabella's face remained carefully composed. "I see. And you came to say goodbye?" "I came to apologize," Blackthorne said, his voice barely above a whisper, "and to give you this." He reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a leather folder. "The deed to your mother's property, the section with the creek where she used to take you riding. It's yours now, free and clear." Isabella took the folder with shaking hands, her composure finally cracking. "Father... I know I can't undo the past, Isabella. I know I failed you as a father in ways that matter most. But I want you to know that seeing what you've built here, the life you've created with Tom, the way you've changed this community for the better... Blackthorne's voice broke. "I'm proud of you. Prouder than I ever deserved to be." Tears were streaming down Isabella's face now, and Tom moved instinctively to her side, offering his support. "I forgive you," Isabella said softly. "I forgave you. A long time ago, Father. I just didn't know how to tell you." The reunion was tearful.